Hey guys, and welcome back to the second video in our tier list series. This time we'll be looking at 1d4 defenses. If you missed out on my 1e4 defense list, then please go check that video out. As always, if you enjoyed the content and found it helpful, please consider dropping a like or commenting down below, and let's get started. Okay, let's kick things off with the Queen's Gambit Declined, which starts out d5, c4, and then pawn to e6. This is by far one of the most solid options, but it's extremely dry to play, I find, and there's a lot more fun options, especially at a lower level, to try out, but it deserves to be at the very top. Next one is the Vienna. It can come out from a few different move orders, but one popular one is knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, and black will capture the pawn on c4. So we lead in some very forcing variations here, but black is doing fairly well if you know what you're doing. One of the world's leading experts would be Levon Aronian, so if you want to play it, then check out his games. The next one is the Dutch. The Dutch is a little bit more offbeat, but people who want something a little bit more aggressive and sharp and going for some very novel and interesting positions, then this would be a good option for you. Next, let's look at some of the Benonis, starting with the old Benoni. So the old Benoni starts after c5. White plays pawn to d5 usually, and then black will either play the move pawn to e6 or pawn to e5. The downside with this sort of structure is that white gets the c4 square for the knight, and we consider knight can maneuver to f3 and eventually to c4, and black is also a little bit cramped and doesn't have so much space. Just because of this, I would put it a little bit lower. The next one we go into is the modern Benoni. Starts out knight f6, we have c5, d5, e6, knight c3, and black will capture here, followed by the move pawn to d6. The drawback of this opening is that white will often get a huge pawn center, so we'll get the pawn to e4 and then f4, and eventually maybe push the pawn to e5. Black will get counterplay on the queen side, so the play can get a little bit sharper, but I would put it more on the unsound side. So modern Benoni is somewhere in the middle. The next one is the snake Benoni. This is a variation of the modern Benoni, which happens after bishop to d6. The idea is that we're trying to improve by putting our bishop on the queen side instead of keeping it locked up on g7. So we'll play the same way and maneuver the bishop to c7 and possibly a5 or b6. The drawback is sometimes white can push the move pawn to d6 to try and take advantage of this bishop move. So it's probably a little bit lower than the Benoni, playable but more as a surprise weapon. So next let's take a look at the Chigorin. The Chigorin happens after d5, c4, and then black plays the move knight to c6. So this one's a little bit more offbeat. It can catch your opponents off guard sometimes, but I wouldn't say you get into the best positions. We're just trying to avoid a lot of our opponents' main lines. Probably just tricks category. The Nimzo Indian here. Knight to f6, c4, pawn to e6, knight c3, bishop b4, pinning the knight, and this is by far one of the easiest and most solid options when starting out. The reason I say that is because we're developing our pieces and black is already prepared to castle next move, so we don't run into as many development problems as say white would in this particular case, because he still has a few pieces to develop, and I feel that it's very easy to learn. So Nimzo Indian is definitely an excellent option. The next one is the Ragozin. The Ragozin can take place similar to the Nimzo. Let's say after knight f3, black plays the move pawn to d5. We get into a Ragozin. Again, Ragozin is a very top tier opening. Next one is the a6 variation. This is fairly newer opening. It happens after knight to f3. Black will play the move pawn to a6. I don't mind this move. I actually quite like it. I see that there's a lot of flexibility. Black's idea is to hold off from committing to either d5, c5, sometimes even play b5. But it only works against knight f3, I would say. Against knight c3 it doesn't work as well. But there is a lot of flexibility to this move, and it's definitely a very playable option. The Tiger Modern is for those who play the Modern perhaps as an opening against one e4 and want to keep the same repertoire against d4 as well. This is a very good option. It starts after pawn to g6, c4, bishop g7. The idea is that after d6, e4, black is not going to play the King's Indian because we don't want to learn all that theory. Instead, black will play either the move pawn to e5 or black will play knight to d7. It's also a very good option, but I wouldn't say it's as good as the mainline King's Indian. The Benko Gambit happens after c4, c5, d5. Black will play the move pawn to b5, and after the captures, we'll gambit a pawn with a6. The idea is to open up some lines of attack on the queen side. This is more of a surprise weapon, I would say, and I wouldn't use it as my main repertoire all the time. Next one is the Grunfeld. Grunfeld's a great option for players who are looking for an aggressive option with open positions. Black plays the move pawn to d5 here, but you really have to know what you're doing in the Grunfeld. White has many options here you can play, and you just need to study them very well. This is a very good surprise option that might catch some of your opponents off guard. There's also lots of flexibility with the two knights. The idea is that if white plays knight c3, we hit out with the move pawn to e5, and then we get sort of a mixture between a Nimzo and sometimes even a King's Indian. So it's very flexible. The only problem I have with it is white can play the move knight to f3 here and stop e5, which forces us to play either g6, e6 or d6 structures, and it can get a little bit passive sometimes, but it's an excellent option overall, and it's definitely playable. I would put it in the middle here. So I'm not a big fan of the Budapest Gambit because I believe it's just all tricks. One of the main tricks black is looking for is knight to g4, and after knight f3, knight c6, bishop f4, bishop b4. I believe one of the tricks black is looking for is knight takes e5 here. The capture on the bishop, and then black will checkmate in the center of the board with knight to d3. The other trap black has here is to play knight to e4, again hoping for white to fall into one of his traps. After b6, wants white to play queen to d5, bishop b7, and then take the bishop here, after which knight c6 would in fact trap the queen on b7, because queen a6 runs into knight c5 and then pawn to a6. Probably in the just tricks or maybe even trash category, because long term it's not going to be the best opening for your chess. So next one on the list is the Queen's Indian. This goes hand in hand with the Nimzo. After e6, knight f3. So there's no pin here with bishop to b4. So instead black will play b6 and then follow up with bishop b7 or bishop a6. And this is extremely solid opening. I'll put it at the very top. The next one is the Bogo. So here the Bogo would begin with bishop check. This is a very good opening as well to pair with the Nimzo. The only difference between this and the Queen's Indian is I would say this one would get into slightly more passive structures, whereas the Queen's Indian is a little bit more active. The next one is the Albin counter gambit. It starts out the d5, c4, e5. The idea is that if white takes it, black will play d4 and then sacrifice a pawn with pawn to f6 later on and knight c6 and develop his pieces quickly and go for some initiative. So this is particularly good in faster time controls, but I would say this is more of a just tricks opening. The next one is the King's Indian. The King's Indian is a favorite of many players against 1d4. After c4, g6, black plays bishop g7, allowing 3 pawns in the center, and black will play d6 here. Some people would say that the King's Indian is a little bit unsound, but I'd say overall as a opening it's an excellent choice. And those who are looking for aggressive play and don't mind playing somewhat closed position sometimes, this should be an opening you should definitely consider. Next one we have is the Slav. There's a lot of flexibility when it comes to the Slav. You can play many different structures here as black. Overall, I think it's just a very good quality opening. I'd probably put it in the champion tier. Next we have the Stonewall Dutch. The only downside with the Stonewall Dutch is that there's not much flexibility and we leave a lot of positional holes in the center. Yes, black is trying to get some counterattack going by pushing his kingside pawns and playing around the weaknesses, but because of that I would put it a little bit lower, but it's definitely a perfectly playable option. Maybe I put it like in the middle actually. It's not overly bad. So next one on the list is the Tarrasch. Happens after d5, c4, e6, knight c3, c5. This is playable and you'll get into some sharp unbalanced positions, although the middle games tend to lead towards some IQP and weaknesses for black. And so because of this, I would put it a little bit lower on the respectable pile. The next option is the Queen's Gambit Accepted. This one is very solid. After pawn takes c4, in some ways similar to the Queen's Gambit Declined, although positions are a lot more open. So I would put it a bit higher on the list in the champion tier. The next one is the English Defense. English Defense is those playing a Nimzo, but we want to avoid, let's say, the Catalan. If you play b6 here, trying to avoid g3, bishop g2, there's a major downside because white can start with the move pawn to f3 instead. And now if you play bishop to b7, white will play the move pawn to e4. And yes, you can still play this line and it's been played by some top players before, but it's not really a Queen's Indian, nor is it a Nimzo. It's a completely different structure. So it's playable, but it's not the most popular. I would put it a little bit lower on this list. And finally, the last one on this list is the Baltic, which is one I didn't find out about until very recently. Starts out after d5, c4, bishop to f5. I think there's many ways for white to get a very comfortable edge here, so I wouldn't put this opening that highly, probably at the very bottom. So those are my picks against 1d4. Of course, all the openings on this list are perfectly playable and you can have fun trying them out. Thanks for watching this video and I'll catch you on the next one.